So there's a prologue to this presentation. An investor in the renewable industry recently commenting on the Trump victory. It felt like a boot off the throat. Every morning I wake up happier than the day before. Same investor. We believe a second energy silver bullet is coming, nuclear fusion. The same bad ideas that effectively outlawed fission are going to try to outlaw fusion. We should not let them. Same investor. We believe that since human wants and needs are infinite, economic demand is infinite. Markets are the ultimate infinite game. Who owns the sun? It's a seemingly ridiculous question. One could imagine sci-fi narratives in which moons or planets might eventually become subject to the law of property. So we could have subdivisions on the moon or mining on Mars. But the sun, impossible. There's just no way, it seems, that one could put up fences on its surface or collect up all the energies it shines out into the universe. And yet, the battle over just who owns the energy of the sun is now in the process of being fought out. The practices of energy ownership definitive of the era of fossil fuels are in all too many cases quickly being extended to renewables. The ownership with which I'm concerned in this short lecture isn't the control of renewable energy technologies, sites, systems, or networks by companies or governments, though we could certainly talk about those. Rather, it's about who is trying to lay claim to the narratives guiding our transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, how they are doing so, and why and to what ends. The emergence of the sun and water and wind and earth, sun here just means all of the renewables, it's a stand-in. The emergence of the sun as a source of power that might soon eclipse fossil fuels constitutes a transition whose effects will go well beyond the type of energy we use. Even the International Energy Agency, the IEA, recognizes this. The IEA's 2002 World Energy Report, which it reaffirmed this in the 2003 report, projects that owing to the rapid greening of energy systems, CO2 emissions from the power sector will likely peak in 2025. They write, global fossil fuel use has risen alongside gross domestic product since the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Putting this rise into reverse while continuing to expand the global economy will be a pivotal moment in energy history. For many around the world, this civilizational shift promises new economic, social, and political possibilities. For others, it's a threat to be managed, controlled, or eliminated altogether. Even in the IEA short summary of where we now find ourselves in energy history, one can find an example of the narratives of transition that interest me and the social and political imaginaries at play within them. For the IEA, the continued expansion of the global economy is a priority above all else, and the reduction of CO2 emissions is to be welcomed, as how could it not be, but it's to be welcomed, but the uncertainties of the post-fossil fuel era certainly are not to be. These uncertainties go beyond figuring out how to balance economic expansion with climate change mitigation strategies. They extend to what 2025 means for the future of capitalism and to the possibility of deep disruption to the norms and values that underpin the production, distribution, and consumption of all things, including energy, from the start of the age of oil up to the present. The anxiety that the IEA expresses, which positions renewable energies and growth as potential antagonists, is a common one. Indeed, it might be seen as the starting point for all narratives intent on explaining the shape our renewable futures will take. The current forceful pushback on renewables by some governments and the fossil fuel industry is due in part to their understanding of this antagonism as an immutable reality. They argue that growth is impossible without fossil fuels and that working class jobs depend on the continuation of extraction. For these reasons alone, transition must happen slowly and steadily if it is to take place at all. But at this point in history, even those governments and fossil fuel companies resistant to energy transition recognize its inevitability, as evidenced by investments in renewables made by both international and national oil companies as early as the 1980s. In the main, delay tactics on transition hope not only to push the peak date of 2025 forward in time to 2030 or 2040 or even later, so that in the interim, profit can continue to be reaped on capital invested in extraction. A related narrative proposed by defenders of fossil fuels foregrounds technological innovation as the way to resolve the antagonism between GDP growth and CO2 decline. For those who continue to want to extract, new technologies such as hydrogen or carbon capture, utilization, and storage offer a means by which the consequences of fossil fuel use can be managed so that old-fashioned growth can continue. Whether CCUS works matters less than the appearance of technology having come to the rescue to allow oil to keep flowing smoothly and steadily. These aren't the only arguments to keep the energy status quo and reap the supposed benefits that accompany it. What I focused on in Futures of the Sun, this is where there's a cut, so what I focused on in Futures of the Sun is a far messier set of narratives now in the process of being written, still in the process of being written, told, and sold about who should own the sun and what it means to do so. These narratives are not yet fully coherent ones, nor would one expect them to be. They're now, right now, being tested in the space of uncertainty captured in the IEA's assessment of where we find ourselves. The post-fossil fuel narratives that I explore are all attempts to reaffirm status quo forms of political, economic, and technological power. I look at the way in which advocates for post-global liberalism, contra-populism, or at least they believe they're trying to go against populism, the way that advocates for post-global liberalism argue that liberal nationalism is the only way in which to combat climate change. I also explore the way in which neoliberalism is being extended to decision-making about climate change and energy transition. In this case, the failure of the nation-state to take effective charge of energy transition is being used by private industry and entrepreneurs as further evidence of the need for them to lead the way in shaping what the world will look like in post-2025. And in this short book, I'm talking about what the different elements of the short book are, I end with an assessment of the role energy plays in contemporary populist nationalisms. And that's what I'm going to focus on here today. In these nationalisms, energy transition is viewed as a threat to populism's power and legitimacy, and fossil fuel extraction is foregrounded as an essential element of tradition. The degree to which any one of these narratives comes to define the politics of the post-fossil fuel era will depend on its success at becoming the norm against which others are forced to measure themselves. In essence, we can see each of them struggling at this moment to transform themselves into the undisputed common sense about how to approach energy transition and climate change. Stuart Hall and Alan O'Shea famously describe common sense as comprising, quote, frameworks of meaning with which to make sense of the world. This idea of common sense shares similarities with other concepts such as what Antonio Gramsci described as spontaneous consent, and perhaps even more so with Louis Althusser's classic description of ideology as the recognition by subjects that, quote, it's really true, that this is the way it is, not some other way. They have recognized that all is well, and they say, for good measure, so be it. But there's a reason that I prefer common sense as a way to describe positions that subjects and institutions name as irrefutable. The notion of common sense is not just a description of an already achieved state, or it's not only that, but names the ongoing active struggle to establish a norm, perhaps especially in situations in which one does not yet exist. Appeals to common sense are a way of bringing people into the narrative fold, an almost effortless way of defining an us, those who recognize the given and only way of doing things, versus a them, those who, it is implied, in the appeal hold extreme or critical views or who just don't get it. In other words, common sense is something that has to be made. Each of the narratives of the renewable futures at which I look at make the case that its views are common sense precisely because they are anything but. So the struggle to define a common sense around energy transition involves, I'm off of one slide somehow, but I'll try to get back on track. Must be the cut. The struggle to define a common sense around energy transition involves three competing claims: the globalist environmentalism of liberal capitalist states, the ethical entrepreneurialism exemplified by figures like Bill Gates, and the reactionary anti-eco politics of the right. To explore how I think this works, I'm going to focus just on this latter one, on the anti-eco politics of the right. And I'm going to focus on Canada, where right-wing politics have fused fossil fuel dependency with libertarian freedoms, conspiracy theories, and nationalist narratives. We can talk a little bit more about this odd configuration in other fossil-fueled nations, perhaps, in the questions. Okay, so that was the introduction following the prologue. Now I'm going to get to part one. The shape of the contemporary politics of fossil fuels in Canada is the outcome of an extended history of intergovernmental conflict over extraction that has now indelibly sutured the identity of the Canadian right to big oil. The origin of the enmity between the province of Alberta and the federal government of Canada extends back to the 1930s and the birth of the now defunct ultra-conservative Social Credit Party. But the start of the disputes that we're dealing with now dates back really to the National Energy Program, or the NEP, which was initiated in 1980 by the Canadian federal government to, I mean, it's not quite the case, but to effectively nationalize aspects of the industry. This was done in part to respond to the financial challenges that the industry was facing due to the 1973 oil crisis. There was fierce and unrelenting opposition to the National Energy Program in Alberta and Western Canada, led by government and the oil industry, which helped to bring about its end in 1985. A popular bumper sticker at the time, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark," a sentiment that, it has to be said, remains in place up to the present and is kept alive by industry and government in Alberta, either working separately or, as is more common, working together. The perceived overreach of the federal government on resource control and management was also the impetus between the formation of the far-right Canadian Alliance and Reform parties, both committed to representing the interests of Western Canadians federally. These parties now form the heart of the contemporary Conservative Party in Canada and the United Conservative Party in Alberta. To claim that the desire to control resources was the origin of right-wing populism in Canada would probably be an overstatement. But to claim that there isn't a deep interrelation between the two would be to miss why it is so important for the right in Canada to affirm resource extraction as an element of Alberta's heritage and tradition, which it perpetually must defend from all those who seek to end it. The threat posed by the National Energy Program has had repercussions in the fossil fuel industry as well. In its wake, industry has ever more aggressively sought to shape public opinion on the import of extraction to life in Canada. I began these lectures by quoting the International Energy Agency, which stated that the era of oil is over. And I think that there's no doubt that Canadian industry recognizes that this is true, that the era of oil is coming to an end, especially because its main site of extraction, the Athabasca oil sands, has become a globally recognized sign of everything that is wrong with extraction economies. In response, the Alberta oil industry has sought to legitimate oil sands extraction in whatever way it can. It has supplemented the work sympathetic governments have done on behalf of industry with an increasingly savvy undercover campaign intended to gnaw away at public opposition to its practices. Two examples highlight this, and I could offer many more, but I'll just focus on these two. The first is the recent public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaign established by the government of Alberta, which was tasked with the mission to fight misinformation, as they saw it, about oil and gas by environmental advocacy and civil society organizations. This was a remarkable attempt to twist the narrative on what counts as legitimate knowledge about the industry, transforming environmental groups into antagonists, spreading misinformation instead of festering it out, as we would tend to see it in this room. I should just say, I may say this later in this presentation, but I'll just say here, this public inquiry went on for 2 years. It was really set up by the government to find that groups like Greenpeace were faking information, were aggressively going against the government. And the task force that they themselves set up found that there was really no evidence about this at all. I'm not sure what happened to the commissioner, if he got fired or what, but. The second example I'm going to give is here, the Pathways Alliance, which has publicly articulated a plan for how to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions from the oil sands by 2050. The alliance was established by the 6 companies that together operate 95% of oil sands production. Canadian National, these are the companies, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, Imperial, Meg Energy, and Suncor. A visit to the Alliance's website shows how expertly industry adapts the language of the Paris Agreement to its explanation of how it intends to achieve net zero. The now standard language of environmental goals to be achieved and newfound commitments to be made to social political issues. To give an example, they put a land acknowledgement on the bottom of every single page of their website. So they kind of use this language of environmental goals and of civil action groups and of anything that seems to be a way to show that they're good actors in the Canadian political scene. So they put these always out there to try to bury the lead. Industry hopes to get to net zero not by reducing or eliminating extraction, but by using new technologies such as carbon capture and storage to manage its greenhouse gas production. I'm going to cut that part. The supposed commitment of the fossil fuel industry to the tenets of the Paris Agreement is just one approach to get Canadians to remain committed to extraction. Another has been to insist on the specific social and political importance of Canadian oil. The campaign launched by industry and government to explain that oil from the oil sands matters because of its Canadianness has 2 stages. The first was captured in Ezra Levant's 2010 Ethical Oil, the case for Kennedy, oh sorry, I can't see these. Anyway, ethical oil. Levant's argument is simple. Fossil fuels are still necessary, and as most countries don't produce enough of their own, they must buy the stuff from somewhere. Most fossil fuels are produced in petrostates with poor human rights records and led by totalitarian governments unable to escape the oil curse. By contrast, Canada produces a uniquely ethical oil because it originates in a first world democratic country, known for being a global leader in human rights. In opposition to environmentalists who want to limit or stop oil sands production, Levant writes, "The question is not whether we should use oil sands oil instead of some perfect fantasy fuel that hasn't yet been invented. Until that miracle fuel is invented, the question is whether we should use oil from the oil sands or oil from other places in the world that pump it." In the years immediately following the publication of Levant's book, ethical oil was widely employed by industry to reinforce the legitimacy of continued extraction until the term faded from widespread use. The notion of ethical oil was revived in 2010 by Ontario Proud, a right-wing group committed to returning power to the people in a series of ads and via its website stopsaudioil.com, an older message perfectly suited to the, that has been kind of adapted to the xenophobic Trump era. I'm just going to say 2 asides here. So this isn't something that just shows up on the web. This Ontario Proud booked advertising on Toronto tram cars, so the entire car would be tricked out with what you see here at the bottom. And it would say, look at this terrible place, Saudi Arabia. Look at this place, Nigeria. Look at these places where there's ecocide, there's gender relations that are damaged by oil. hey, Canadian oil. This is still going on, still recent. The other side, I'll say, is one of the most brilliant rebuttals that I've seen against the speaker was Darren Barney, when he kind of spontaneously spoke back to Ezra Levant, who did a presentation at McGill University as part of the second petrocultures. So a variant of this approach has been industry's frequent assertions that it represents Canadian values and plays an essential role in the life of the country. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, has mounted several increasingly sophisticated campaigns along these lines. Its Raise Your Hand for Canada campaign shows pictures of mostly white Canadians holding up a hand, fingers spread, over which is pasted the outline of a maple leaf. The concluding lines of the ad copy ask the question, think energy developed the Canadian way is good for Canada? The answer CAP wants to hear, that now is the time to say so by raising your hand. So in social media, people actually did this, and it was circulated around Instagram and other social media. They showed pictures of themselves doing this. The latest campaign to marry oil with Canadian values was initiated in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The website Made the Canadian Way asks, if your oil and gas came with a label, what would you learn? The label posted online tells us that Canada's oil and gas are innovation-driven and responsibly produced. This campaign was mounted by the Canadian Energy Centre, as I say here, which was actually created by the government of Alberta to support industry in whatever way possible. This is one of those examples of greenwashing where they're passing themselves as something else. Indeed, again, the government of Alberta, the people that actually led that public inquiry I was telling you about was this Canadian Energy Centre, and kind of at a distance, the government of Alberta. So what is the takeaway from these government and industry campaigns? Are we supposed to understand fossil fuels as a good belonging to all Canadians, as industry and ad campaigns seem to suggest, or to Albertans alone, which is the standpoint of the Alberta government? Is industry genuinely committed to decarbonizing, or do all such claims constitute little more than greenwashing? The National Energy Program is dead. How then are we meant to understand the current relationship between the federal and provincial governments? It's now been 45 years since that National Energy Program is gone, and yet this animus is still there. Large segments of the public, both inside and outside of Alberta, continue to believe that the federal government is impeding the financial success of the fossil fuel industry and so must be resisted. While the federal government has begun to implement a carbon tax, the proceeds of which it returns to Canadians, it also continues to provide enormous subsidies to industry. During the pandemic alone, oil and gas industries in Canada received more than $18 billion in subsidies. For 4 decades on, the legacy of the National Energy Program has been rewritten by successive right-wing governments and their industry comrades in a way that has made the private appear to be public. That Canadian public owns oil when it's in fact owned by private industry, even while managing to retain the notion that there is a danger that the federal government will nationalize the oil industry. That is, make public what ideologically has already been rendered public in most Canadian minds. Rendering oil ownership this way has proved to be incredibly effective common sense, regardless of how twisted its logic is and how illogical it may be, that has made any thought of changes to the dominant energy system in Canada very difficult to parse. The political common sense that I've just named is filled with contradictions, and deliberately so. Organized around oppositions that can flip-flop as needed. From being in favor of business to apparently being against it, from opposing nationalism to embracing it. What is certain, however, is that energy transition and environmental policies, even to a limited degree, have been positioned as threats to established political systems whose ongoing legitimacy deeply depends on continuing fossil fuel extraction. To the frustrated middle classes created by neoliberalism, Industry and their governmental representatives have repeatedly offered an answer about what is going wrong. Misguided technocrats are messing with resources essential to their self-identity and livelihood, and doing so by employing globalist environmental policies that fail to attend to national identity, sometimes expressed in provincial guise. The result is that in Canada, the xenophobia of right-wing populisms has been shaped not only by exclusions defined by race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, but also by differences with respect to energy resources in a very, very deep way. A unique political configuration with serious consequences for energy transition and climate action in the country. Given the confusions I've just described, which shape belonging and tradition, private and public, into complex figures, it is perhaps unsurprising that adding one more ingredient to this stew of ideas, positions, and counterpositions would generate new uncertainties that would result in a crisis. The month-long Freedom Convoy, also known as the Truckers' Convoy, which made its way across Canada before reaching Ottawa on January 29, 2021, was kicked off by just such an event, which mobilized the center-periphery narratives developed around extraction to new ends, that center-periphery being the West and the center. The extended occupation of downtown Ottawa in and around Parliament Hill was the immediate result of the imposition of vaccine mandates on truckers crossing the US-Canadian border, which frustrated truckers who had decided not to be vaccinated. To show their displeasure at the vaccine mandate and its impact on their livelihoods, a small minority of Canada's long-haul truckers, accompanied by their supporters, descended on the nation's capital to vent their frustrations. The protest was never very large, although it got an enormous amount of media attention. On the first day of the gathering in Ottawa, there were an estimated 8,000 protesters, and I just wanted to compare this to a 2019 climate march in Montreal that had 500,000 people in the streets. So we start with 8,000 on the first day. By the following day, the numbers had dropped to fewer than half, with a continual decline over the life of the protest. So it started January 21, it ended February 23rd after the imposition of the Emergencies Act, a seldom employed act that grants temporary power to the federal government to deal with emergencies it views as threats to the country's sovereignty and security. Nevertheless, despite its size, the convoy had a real impact. And it's not due to, again, its size or the length of time that it was in Ottawa. I think it's because of the X-ray it offered of the contemporary state of Canadian political life. The hesitation at all levels of government to intervene in this month-long protest highlights the power of an emerging common sense that can transform all contestation into an affirmation of the reality of its paranoid outlook on the world. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is governments were so afraid to do anything about this protest, which shut down downtown Ottawa, shut down Parliament for a month, that it indicates some hesitation about pissing off people that might be out there and that might be in the majority. You don't know. Now, there was always something off about the accepted narrative of the principal cause of the protest. So, remember I said that it was truckers who didn't want to, anti-vaxxers, they didn't want to be vaccinated crossing the US-Canada border, and they expressed this anger at the Canadian government. But it was the imposition of the US for cross-border travel that impeded non-vaccinated Canadian truckers from hauling goods across the border, not a law imposed by the Canadian federal government. Okay, when you got to the border on the Canadian side, who's not letting you in? It's the US. Okay. This is something that convoy organizers conveniently avoided mentioning. The initial demands for an end to the government vaccine mandate very quickly transformed into a clarion call for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to leave office. This was perhaps to be expected. Neither Tamara Lich nor BJ Dichter, the organizers of the
GoFundMe and Give Send Me Go campaigns used to generate support for the convoy. Neither of those people were truckers, nor was Ontario convoy organizer Jason LaFace, who was a member of the ultra-right group, Canada Unity. All three of these people had been associated with prior anti-federal movements. Litch, for instance, was a member of the Maverick Party, previously known as Wexit, which advocated for the independence of Western Canada from the rest of the country. Read generously, the Freedom Convoy could be seen as an expression of general frustration against a government unable or unwilling to address the concerns of ordinary Canadians. When asked by media what the demands of the convoy were, Dichter said, "It's everything. It's everything." But the reality is more ominous. In addition to a familiar Western separatist ideology of the kind framed in relationship to control over extraction, over oil extraction that I've been detailing here, it's clear that the imperatives of the convoy were shaped at least in part by QAnon. Conspiracy theorists, other kinds of conspiracy theorists, and a range of US-based right-wing groups. Hack of the donor list of the Give, Send, Go campaign confirmed this. 55.7% of the donors to this group were from the United States and included prominent donors to Donald Trump's campaign. A far greater indication of US involvement in Canadian politics than that had been found previously by, amongst other people, this public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns. In that campaign, it indicated, one of the things that they were supposed to find out is these activist groups that were going against Alberta oil, were they getting lots of foreign money to do this? That was one of the things that the government wanted this commission to find, and they found that it was not the case, that it was insignificant. Now, this convoy may have been framed in response to a vaccine mandate as unpopular as Bill Gates is. As unpopular as Bill Gates is in some parts of the country, according to Google Trends, Bill Gates, anytime you have Bill Gates and a vaccine mandate in Canada, there's a constant level of online searches by Canadians. But at its core, this protest was about fossil fuels. To mobilize its participants, the organizers depended on the persistence of a regional politics anchored in deep-seated political disputes originating, at least in part, from the National Energy Program. The right-wing ability to generate legitimacy for its positions by sliding from federal to provincial and back again allowed it to maintain a persistent confusion about the coronavirus pandemic. The federal government was held wholly culpable for an issue that fell under provincial jurisdiction. Under the terms of the Canadian Constitution, provinces are responsible for the provision of health. In the wake of its quick abandonment of the plight of the unvaccinated truckers, one of the main demands organizers of the convoy made was for the Governor General to dissolve the government, which she cannot do unless the government has lost the confidence of the House of Commons, which of course they were unable to meet. So that's like another kind of endless contradiction in all of these things. It's unlikely that anything would have been gained by suggesting to Lick, Dichter, and the convoy participants that they read up on the Constitution, of course. No argument could possibly cut the ideological taut Gordian knot that binds two contradictory ideas together. The rejection of any and every action of government, so remember, it's everything, and the demand that the selfsame government act to undo itself. The hope that government might be able to undo the wrong it represents due to its very existence is further complicated by the starting premise that it can only ever manage to fuck things up. The Canadian politics of fossil fuel can be seen as a key to the convoy in even more direct ways. In 2020, the Freedom Convoy built on the lessons of an earlier truck convoy to Ottawa. In February 2019, a convoy called United We Roll brought hundreds of truckers to Ottawa to protest the federal government's introduction of a carbon tax and the development of strengthened environmental assessments of energy projects, as well as its ban on oil tankers on the northern coast of British Columbia. Some of those at the 2019 protests were also there to express their displeasure at the drop in oil prices, and so drop in profits and job numbers. Bizarre demand, if not for the view held by many Canadians that the government has at least some control over oil price. United We Roll was the concluding act of Canada's own version of the Gilets Jaunes protests, which saw yellow-vested Canadians protesting simultaneously against greenhouse gas policies and cultural threats posed by Muslims, immigrants, and the LGBT community. More recently, there have been calls for yet another convoy, this one to protest the Trudeau government's announced aim of a 30% absolute reduction in nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use. This has been, this intended reduction has been reconfigured by some alt-right media outlets as an initiative to ban the use of any fertilizers. According to Joseph Cannell, a research associate with the right-wing Frontier Center for Public Policy, a new convoy, so that would be the third in 3 years, could be fatal for our climate-obsessed Prime Minister. Finally, the importance of oil for life in Canada is affirmed in the very form taken by the convoy, a protest built out of trucks and saturated by the petro-masculinity and petro-populism connected with convoys ever since the release of the 1978 film Convoy, which is a kind of a reaction to the limitations of the 1973 oil crisis. So the confusing landscape of popular politics I've just painted isn't unique to Canada, of course, even if the degree to which the right has connected it with the oil industry might be. I mean, I guess I would claim here, I hope that I'm making a case that whatever else populism and current right-wing populism, current right-wing politics in Canada is, it's deeply saturated in oil. It's necessary to have oil as part of the picture. Some of its energy, I'm making jokes here, right? Some of its energy, some of its force comes from being connected to oil, being connected to the industry. It is certainly animated, these views, by industry, but it also animates industry. In any case, let me get back here. So we have this very, very confusing landscape of politics in Canada, where you have movement of the right back and forth between federal and provincial culpability, between asserting that the federal government isn't doing anything and it can do everything, between suggesting that the federal government should be responsible for parts of social policy that it can't possibly be responsible for, by saying that the federal government is in bed with Bill Gates and that's why it wants to get vaccines out there, to saying it couldn't possibly have that level of initiative towards anything. So you have this confusing landscape. In his 1995 essay, Fascism, Umberto Eco argues that fascism is grounded in a cult of tradition, but a tradition that is syncretistic, a combination of different forms of belief and practice that must tolerate contradiction. In Canada, fossil fuels have shaped right-wing notions of tradition that have proven able to easily navigate such contradictions. The implications of the right's political syncretism are obvious. Nothing needs to be done with the natural world as long as it remains the place where money magically flows from the ground. To do anything about climate change is to be both anti-Canadian and dangerously opposed to tradition. What might be an appropriate rejoinder to these ideologies of resource extraction? An answer at once conceptual and political that would effectively unnerve the attempt of the right to lay claim to the common sense on energy and our climate futures. An obvious answer, perhaps, or a first answer, or I think the answer that many of us here might reach to, an answer that I would reach to, is science. A discourse imagined to be able to puncture through the fictions and conspiracies on which the right depends to strengthen and grow. But science has proven to be limited in its capacities to articulate a new common sense. In fact, it pushes it away.
It's not able to do a new common sense in part because it positions itself entirely outside of the political spectrum, neither right, left, nor center, and in part because it can be so easily framed as a fiction, articulated by government or industry to suppress rights and freedoms. This is what happens when you print on both sides of the page. Don't try to do that in a sign. Science has unfortunately also animated right-wing conspiracies rather than bringing unbelievers into the fold. It has also had a limited capacity to mobilize action on climate change, even among individuals and polities that recognize the import and significance of its findings. So science doesn't do it. But what about this category of tradition? The category that lies at the heart of right-wing populisms and fascisms, the lost object that reactionaries wish to recover or to produce. Tradition can be exclusionary, violent, degrading, and demoralizing. One might thus be forgiven for thinking that history has little in it to mount substantial challenges to the narratives I've examined here, that history that produces tradition. But remember, tradition is not history. It can be shaped to many ends, as the right knows so well. Tradition makes a demand on the present that can be harder to gainsay than threats posed by an unknown future. Consider the kinds of ideas that might be folded into tradition to challenge the legitimacy of status quo narratives. The nation is little more than a savage fiction, could be part of it. And air, water, sky, and earth, and certainly the energy of the sun belong to everyone. I'm not saying these are part of tradition. I'm saying potentially these could be part of a tradition. These may even have been part of our tradition at one point. Raymond Williams points to tradition as the most powerful mechanism of social incorporation and as fundamental to all politics. For Williams, it is a way in which, quote, from a whole possible area of past and present in a particular culture, certain meanings and practices are selected for emphasis and certain other meanings and practices are neglected or excluded. The problem is thus perhaps not tradition per se, tradition which I said can be exclusionary, violent, degrading, demoralizing. But it's in seeing tradition as fixed and unshakable, something about which there's nothing more that can be said because the passage of time has made all that has come to be into a common sense that cannot be challenged. Conceding tradition to the status quo means forgoing its potential as a powerful political tool to unnerve the powers that be. At least I'd like to make this case. I'd love to hear back from you about this. The environmental movement and the left more generally has tended to see much of what constitutes tradition today as little more than the surviving past, filled with disappointments and dangers. It would be wrong, of course, to suggest there is no tradition of left political achievement, of gains made and goals reached, that acts as a resource for contemporary political action and activism. Given what much of the surviving past looks like as well, progressives can be forgiven for avoiding it, perhaps especially those wishing to insist on the necessity of quick action on energy transition and climate change. The past, after all, is a record of climate failure, and what's needed now is climate action. But along with Williams, I think it's essential for those committed to climate action to make a claim on tradition, even if only as a political device, as a political rhetoric, a means of myth-making to political ends. I have in mind here a deployment of tradition that might address Roland Barthes' criticism of the limits of contemporary left politics, 50 years on, which still strikes me as relevant today, as speaking to some of the limits of contemporary left politics at the moment, which he sees emerging from the reluctance to articulate new social myths, even as the left labors to take apart the myths of others. Barthes writes, "Left-wing myth is inessential. The objects which it takes hold of are rare. Only a few political notions, unless it has itself recourse to the whole repertoire of the bourgeois myths. Left-wing myth never reaches the immense field of human relationships, The very vast surface of, there's the light here is terrible. The very vast surface of insignificant ideology. Everyday life is inaccessible to it. In bourgeois society, there are no left-wing myths concerning marriage, cooking, the home, the theater, the law, morality. Then it is an incidental myth. Its use is not part of a strategy, as is the case with bourgeois myth, but only of a tactics, or at worst of a deviation. If it occurs, it is as myth suited to a convenience, not to a necessity. Barth characterizes the left here in Mythologies, in the last chapter of it, as at best a kind of anti-right. This is how it's ended up framing itself, dependent on the ideas of the right even as it rejects them. As such, left politics can at times amount to little more than a softened myth of the right. What may be missing on the left is the active use of myth and the employment of its capacity to shape tradition as strategy or tactic, in ways, of course, careful not to dismiss the present, in ways that do not dismiss the present as nothing other than evidence of historical failure, a challenging political act to be sure. Barth's Mythologies was published at a time when left politics was very different than it is today, 1957, before the civil rights movement, before we have global challenges to colonial power at the level we have now, before decolonization, before indigeneity became a much more powerful force in the world, before contemporary feminisms, before Black Lives Matters, and all kinds of aspects of environmentalism, including the renewed energies of the 21st century environmental movement, which we heard about in the last panel. Even so, Barth's criticism of the left's capacities for critique and discomfort with myth and tradition still has some bite. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the use of myth and tradition by groups and individuals engaged in climate action is completely absent. My comments are intended to draw attention to a tendency I see that has made it difficult to sharply challenge right-wing narratives against energy transition. These narratives, which I've described here in the examples of Canada and Alberta, which are shameless and aggressive in their reconstitution of tradition to their own ends, and indeed don't worry about contradiction or malapropisms, but try to get across as powerfully as possible their idea of what constitutes the present by speaking to a past that animates it. So just how might this use of tradition work? I'm just going to give an example in closing. It's probably not a satisfactory answer, but I look forward to the discussion. Before the Freedom Convoy came United We Roll, as I mentioned, and both of these were animated by similar aims and intentions, and the former drew considerable political energy from the example of the latter. But there was another convoy that headed towards Ottawa. I'm skipping ahead here. These are people who are supporting the convoy as it heads towards Ottawa. This is an overpass in Toronto. Okay, so this was not just a movement of people outside of the cities. There was another convoy that went to Ottawa, well before the right-wingers guzzled gas on their way to Parliament Hill. Well before this, in June 1935, 1,000 residents of a federal unemployment relief camp left Vancouver to take their protest over poor living conditions to Ottawa. Those in the On to Ottawa trek, as it came to be known, they commandeered freight trains to speed their speed their progress across the continent, often with the support of local communities, always with the support of local communities, and sometimes of local governments. The train convoy picked up strikers along the way, doubling its size by the time it reached Regina, where further progress was blocked by order of Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, who brought in lots of RCMP to make sure that the trekkers didn't go on any further. Talks to address the strikers' concerns were initiated with the office of the Prime Minister, but quickly broke down. Bennett's decision to instead arrest the trekkers resulted in the Regina riot, which happened on Canada Day, July 1st, which brought the trek to an end. It also brought an end to Bennett's career and fueled interest in the Canadian Communist Party, which had provided support for the trek all the way along and indeed was key to initiating it. Might one critique of the Freedom Convoy be that it dishonored the tradition of the Ontario Trek, which was made up of men wanting to be paid more than 20 cents Canadian per day for the work, for their labor, for the work they did, working 55 hours a week? A very different demand than the inchoate demands of the Freedom Convoy trekkers for the Prime Minister to resign just because a few people wanted it? Might this have offered those who participated in the recent convoy, if they knew about it, many of whom had been left behind politically and economically by neoliberalism, left behind in ways similar to these other trekkers? There's a big gap between 36, of course, and 2021. But might, if they had known about it, if this had been part of a tradition, of a kind of a politics, might it have given them new insight into how injustices have been visited upon their communities today? And might there be a way of seeing Canada's national energy program in the 1980s not as a failure, but as a program intent on honoring a commitment to equality among Canadians, including equality with respect to their resources? In the era of climate change, the reinstitution of a program like the National Energy Program, which was, to be sure, was not without its problems, could change the direction of resource politics in Canada. But instead, the federal government has chosen to continue to support industry by, for instance, purchasing the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline from Kinder Morgan in 2018 for $4.5 billion Canadian. I think the cost has since expanded to $7.8 billion. A new program to bring about energy transition and fast would bring us nowhere close to the common imagined in political philosophy, but it is a step in a process that may well be crucial to achieving real energy transition and truly addressing the causes and consequences of climate change. I started by talking about common sense. The power of common sense comes from the immediate intuitive claim it can make to speak on behalf of the center, that apparently non-ideological, inclusive, and democratic space in which the only statements made are ones on which everyone agrees. In making this claim, common sense asserts its right to speak for the most saleable aspects of tradition. The end of the oil era does not denote the end of capitalism, nor does the expanding use of renewable energy produce, ipso facto, new, far better ways of living together and in the world. A world of clean energy can fuel a world that is still shaped by racism, sexism, discrimination based on class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and more. The future of the sun won't depend on the technological sophistication of solar panels and the storage capacity of batteries. It will depend on our willingness to forcefully challenge those narratives of energy transition that promise change while insisting that we keep everything exactly as it is. It will depend, too, on our ability to tell convincing stories about the traditions we need and want to honor, and those to which it is no longer worth paying any attention because they have gotten us nowhere. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious about, we're talking about the far right and shift to the far right, but actually my question is about leftish people in Canada. Are they also tired of Trudeau? What is actually what is their vision of Canada, future of Canada, and where they are. So I'm quite, I know about shift of the far right, but what left people do think?
I don't think the left was ever, the left was never interested in Trudeau. So there's that. Trudeau is of a elite center that has run Canada for much of its history. Even when there have been conservatives, parties in the past that were center parties, they were kind of liberals as well. I used to tell my students that the Liberal Party in Canada is kind of like what the PRI was in Mexico at one time. So the PRI, I think, in the 20th century was in government for 90 of the years. The Liberals are not quite that bad, but they certainly understand themselves not to be a party, but to be government. So for the parties and the individuals farther on the left, this was certainly an improvement, I think, on what was there, but there's not a substantial difference between this government and other governments. Now, one could argue that there's, of course, more money towards social policy, but the program is incoherent. Here, we are talking here about energy and about environment, and the Liberal Party of Canada has been amongst the most egregious, probably one of the worst parties on the planet in terms of what it's done on environmental issues. So Canada has not fulfilled any degree of its Paris Agreement, nothing. Our emissions have not gone down really at all. It depends on, if you look at different parts of the country, it looks differently. So what is the left in relation to this? Yeah, the left wants a different kind of Canada. It wants a movement away from extraction. But I feel strange about talking about it as if it's a coherent body. And I'll just give you one example, because I want lots of questions, not talk a lot. The New Democratic Party would be seen as the institutional left, the party left. And when they were the party in government in Alberta, they continued to do work in the oil sector. They did not oppose the oil sector in any substantial way. They were making plans towards phasing out oil, but in a quite timid way, I would say. They set a date that they had some ideas of moving towards. They did set in policies that resulted recently in Alberta no longer using any coal for its power system. But in terms of governance, two things, I suppose. I don't know if the left has had, the institutional left has really had the power has been in a position where they could make those decisions. So I don't really have a lot of examples. And when they have had that opportunity, they have not taken it up. So last word here is the current government, the Trudeau government, is a minority government. It's backed by the New Democratic Party. They're in a coalition government. At any point, that party could have made demands on the government to act differently, and it hasn't. The federal government of Canada should not own a pipeline, a very expensive pipeline that it purchased from a private company.
Thank you, lmre. I'm going to ask sort of the question you asked me back to you, because you have me interested in nationalism. It struck me, listening to your talk, that the Freedom Convoy was about the freedom for bodies to move across borders despite the laws of the other country they were entering, which is so deeply ironic. I mean, it was essentially a open border movement, given the anti-immigrant feeling. But that also raised to me the question of nationalism and tradition. And I don't know, I guess I'll put back, I'm worried about tradition. I understand and want to embrace this idea of rewriting, like what are our traditions. But even in the positive sense of that, I see over and over it turned into ethno-nationalist or fascist lines, like traditionally our connection to nature or food growing traditions or, so I wonder, it also makes me think there are actually, because you showed a picture of indigenous peoples, there are, maybe the problem is Westerners' problem, like because of nationalism, our traditions are so violent and terrible. It's this like imagining ourselves out of our own violent history. And this is the other flawed move, is that then we turn to other cultures for their traditions because, like, you know, the sort of indigenous tradition or right now Latin American cosmologies or, yeah, I guess I'm just, so far the move towards tradition to me has had some flaws and problems, and in the Western sense feels like it collapses into nationalism or some kind of racist thing. So what do we need? I am always saying we need new stories, but you know, I'm with you, but do we need tradition? Because tradition, yeah.
Yeah. Precisely the question that needs to be asked, these questions. So I don't know if you can have a politics that doesn't animate tradition as something to rally around, as something that people can see their relationship to one another through one another. Now, I think often what I hear about often what I read about, often what I hear about at conferences that environmentalists have, they'll say, we need new stories. We need new stories. It frustrates the hell out of me because then it kind of ends up being, oh, here's a Cli-Fi novel or something, or it just ends there. It ends there. There's a labor to the politics of producing something that gets other people interested. And there's absolutely a danger to it. But I'm not quite sure what else you do as a politics, especially when then you concede tradition to the other side. So there's a lot of things that are, you know, snipped out of this, but one would be about the power of tradition in relation to common sense, the power of common sense as an ideology. You can see it like evoked endlessly post the election in the US. Common sense, common sense, common sense, as a rhetoric that you can't challenge. I mean, you can say that's not common sense, right? But it grasps people because it's the safe, non-dangerous space that somehow is what puts us all together. It's non-ideological, you know. And then all of us are like, our labor is to go, no, that's ridiculous. Of course that's ideological. But we have no response to it. So I guess I would say my strong response, which makes me really uncomfortable, is it's what would constitute the terms of a solidarity. And the dangers are that it seems to do a number of things. So one is it's dangerous around intersectionality. That's at least one sense. But intersectionality can be a tradition. Right? Tradition is not the same as history. Tradition can be made. And I suppose the thinkers who have done the most work with tradition in left political philosophy would be Chantal Mouffe or Laclau and Mouffe, who I'm not crazy about, but they're clear about the way that you make a politics, you make a political group. And then you have to get 51% of the people on side. So to your other point, which I think is excellent, I do think that in the absence of a broad sense of what would constitute a left political response, one that is clearly speaks to you, not a left that's just critical. The turn has been to indigenous cosmologies. You see it amongst students, you see it amongst some faculty. It's prepackaged. It's really racist. It's you adopt it. You do it with as much care as you can muster, and yet it's still that. I'm going to forget the name of a poet, but there's a indigenous poet. She recently has a book out. I can tell you. I can look it up quickly, where there's a poem that's against this liberal tendency, where she plays against every move. You know, where you say, I recognize I'm adopting your thing, but I don't mean to do that. Like, I'm actually like kind of being, oh, why are you complaining about it? I'm on your side. Like, she has this kind of endless response to every move of the self-critical liberal that is kind of metacritical of the metacritical of the metacritical, because they desperately want that tradition that they lack, and which is itself a fiction. It's not necessarily this kind of deep animating cosmology for indigenous communities that are modern, that have all kinds of complicated relationships to industry, to the environment, to one another, and want to have that. They're not interested in being pre-modern. But that's something that I think a lot of people in the academy are interested in. They want, not necessarily be pre-modern, but they want some kind of tradition. They want, on the one hand, to make sure to be alert to the fact that there are others with other kinds of traditions, and they have nothing of them of their own. So I will make a strong case. I would at least say, let's think of what else a politics might be. And I completely agree. I'm nervous because I feel tradition can only be nationalism, and I don't think it has to be nationalism. There's something called communist internationalism, for instance.
May I jump with a commentary? Read your talker and Kara's question, and the discussion is very thought-provocative, so I cannot resist. And it's not really a question, but a comment in sort of continuation of your argument. I really like Walter Benjamin's concept, the tradition of the oppressed. If we, and I really like the quote from Bart that you brought here, referring to this mythology. I also remember from Barth that he was saying that ideology or myth is the language that is stolen for the people. So myth or ideology is the language which our power, the powers, those in power use when they talk to the people. So they talk to us in their language of myth or invented ideology, and which does not contradict common sense, but which actually constructs it. But this language is stolen from the people. Therefore, people, the oppressed, they do not have their own language. They cannot formulate in a beautiful way, and they are like stay speechless. In this way, in this sense, the tradition of the oppressed is one that is aimed to reappropriate this stolen language, to give it back to itself. I remember 2 months ago, we had our institute organized another conference, and among the speakers, we were happy to have Svaralipi Nandi from another scholar from India, who gave a wonderful presentation on how in India, so a slightly different perspective, not from the global north, not from Canada, but from the global south, where all the discourse of solarity is appropriated by the right-wing governments and then re-mythologized for the sake of their benefits. So they refer to tradition which they simultaneously invent, and in this tradition legitimizes the current inequalities and also energy injustices that are going on in India and that they are very striking. But as you perfectly demonstrated, there is no contradiction between common sense and ideology. Therefore, common sense is not the thing that can be opposed to ideology. So this is not a good comrade in the struggles. Another reference that comes to my mind is Georges Bataille, who, together with his comrades 100 years ago, were discussing the possibilities to counter the discourse of the growing, rising discourse of fascism, and they were very critical with regards to the liberal democracy and its capacity to counter fascism, and they would say that the left, or the anti-fascist, let's say the anti-fascist movement, what they need is not a democratic, commonsensical knowledge, but they need a myth. They need to invent a myth and even maybe a ritual. So this line is really, yeah, in my understanding, it really makes sense to think about it, and luckily we have a sort of tradition where the natural resources and the human resources are both share this position of the oppressed, and that the oil is exploited almost in the same sense as humans are exploited, those who work on it. Sorry for commenting. I see that there are still some questions, so if you want to
my only comment
on
is that's really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I saw Darren had a question. Yeah.
Thank you, Imre. My question is the same question I always ask you.
Wait, which of the many questions you always ask me?
So you started the talk today saying that it was going to be about property and ownership,
Yeah.
but not the question of who owns the infrastructure and the technology, but instead who's laying claim to the narratives of transition and the social and political imaginaries at work in them. Then a bravura demonstration of doing just that. My question is, like, what comes first? The infrastructures, the material project of transition, or the narrative and the imaginaries? Because it seems that in the way that you set up the presentation and the argument in the book is that somehow the narrative has to come first, right? That we'll only have the whatever you want to call it, the just transition, or beyond a just transition, and environmentally just transition, or the preferred energy future that you also articulate so well. If we have a narrative that displaces the current one and then informs or inspires a different kind of construction of infrastructure. But I would want to push back and say that the order is otherwise, that there's this, so there's a bit of a mystery about what inspires or sustains the production of the alternative infrastructure. And I use infrastructure as a kind of catch-all for, rearranging material relationships of, in this case, energy. And from that is generated the alternative narrative and the alternative imaginary, and then momentum builds, et cetera, right? And so I just wonder what you have to say about that order. And I'll just give a slightly different example that's relevant to what you raised, because when you pointed to the On to Ottawa trek as a kind of alternative imaginary, right? I would suggest whatever, it's 2 years earlier, the Regina Manifesto, right, that comes out of the birth of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was the articulation of a kind of imaginary that involved nationalization of resources and energy infrastructure, because they were all about national electricity grid, et cetera, and all of this. But that came out of a decade of farmers' cooperatives building alternative infrastructure in the grain system, et cetera, that built that thing that eventually got expressed as the imaginary of the CCF, which is probably the tradition that we might want. So that's a counterexample that I would give to kind of illustrate the possibility that the infrastructure building has to happen in advance of the imaginary or the narrative in some way.
You don't like imaginary, so I won't use that. So I think it's a little bit of a chicken egg, because you wouldn't know what the infrastructure you're building is unless you have a sense of what you want to do. But you can't have the infrastructure there. If you're speaking about infrastructure in a broader sense, you're not saying technology, right? You're saying the set of capacities that produce some kind of political outcome. So I mean, I guess it would be a kind of a chicken egg type thing. And if I was downplaying the political infrastructure element of it, it was because of my worry. Well, it's really just about looking at who is producing narratives with their particular infrastructures that are already in place, and the necessity of seeing that those are happening already, and they're there. So it's not only just this is the one example of kind of saying, yeah, we don't want this new thing, transition. That's not in our interest. That messes with how we figure the world. Because there's other ones where, bring it on, we want to bring it. And so one of them I talk about is, yeah, bring it on, but it's actually the kind of the tech bros that do it, because the state doesn't seem to be able to do it, right? So that's one example. But they didn't just come up with it, like as you sort of say. It's like a long project that takes place, whatever, you can pick whatever you want, in and around Stanford University, a long project, where they themselves they didn't have it in advance, right? They're just kind of figuring it out as they go. So the leap to Trump in that case is not out of the blue, right? Or the other one I would look at, where the liberal one might be a bit different. It's kind of like a loss of a. So no, I think that's a good point. And what I will say to that is that all of the things that we've heard here, including especially the last two panels, there is that in the process of being developed, hopefully. There is that when we have these discussions. I don't know if it's enough of a one to bring in a large community. That's part of my anxiety. Part of my anxiety is it's critique only. It stops at the level of critique. Part of my anxiety is I think that there's actually a kind of a techno-utopianism at the heart of some kinds of environmentalism, which is to say, we have the technology, now a difference follows from the technology, right? It's that it produces some difference as opposed to there's no necessary correlation, which I think is actually what you pointed out in your own paper. New technologies of energies has nothing at all to do necessarily with the kinds of economies that it works, and the place of individuals within it, and the rights and freedoms that they might have, and their relationality to one another, which is, I think the worst part of energy humanities is to suggest that there's the deepest correlation between one and the other. That type of fuel is determinant of what a social thing was, how you exist socially. I think that's going too far. It's determining perhaps, but not determinant. So, I mean, what your comment makes me think is that, well, first I'll just say that I think that's correct. and that this is a provocation, this is a rhetoric. My hope is that that's happening. My desire is that that's seen as a project, that's a common project, that now has to take a step towards explaining why it is a project for the world. Actually, Oksana explained that part of it better than I did in my presentation, right? Which is some of this language about human beings being consonant with nature or nature being a subject. Some of this makes me really nervous. Some of it is maybe part of this infrastructure that is precisely what will be the difference that matters from the contemporary articulations of how you are a political subject. So I don't know if that's satisfactory, but I think that helps me with some other things I'm doing. I'll have to be careful about that.
So I have a question about change. I'm thinking about these places where oil arrived in the 1970s and early 1980s, where it arrived and it wiped out a way of life. Like it, with little care and much excitement about cash and people and giant kind of cool technical procedures and getting in and out of places which are inaccessible and getting around governments and just sort of destroying a way of being that was there before. And then building something in its wake that we now live in and stand in and experience as, in some ways, joyful, right? Like it's not all terrible. It's also kind of, I think, a lot of the idea of like the curiosity of large intellectual projects is also linked to that time period, right? There's a lot of our life that comes from that. And now I feel, from what you're saying, and that's the question, that how do we move out of that without the same degree, or sort of senseless, the senseless joy of destroying a world because something exciting, new and exciting has come along. And part of that is that something new and exciting has not really come along. And I think that with solarities or thinking about renewables, it feels a little bit like, gosh, I wish, in a way, like you could write the magic spell, right? Like, let me just tell you the story and I'll tell it to you again, I'll tell it to you again. And it's a way that we take this world we have and we layer upon it some sort of idealized version of how it could play out, right? But it's not like oil. And that there's something really admirable in not taking that sort of burning, right, as the path. And yet, if in your talk it feels like it doesn't move at all. Like how do you get from the point where you've got a crappy garden full of bugs into this other place where you can sort of increase your connection to the world, and you can change the world, and you can move things in ways that make sense to you, because you've got a really good yam, right? But you're not getting that. It feels like that moment. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit about that, like the frustration of not wanting to burn the world down, but just wishing that there were some way to move on anyway. It seems like a new model.
Yeah, okay, so you have, this is a beautiful loop back to your talk, I think. You've articulated both my fears and my desires very well. And there's one bit I would add to it, which is to me a confusing part, which is that this is what we're trying to do around not being a society that through its existence undermines its own existence, undermines the capacity to be on this planet in a way that is that is possible, and at the same time undermines a project, potentially a project that was there and emerging around having a just world, a more equitable world. How do we move from that to something else? So one thing that's unique about it or weird about it is that this is a project that is aware of the necessity of changing the social. Like, it's not a thing that just kind of emerges and we're picking away at different parts of it. And of course, stuff happens narratively in it. It's a project, unlike the first energy transition where you had no idea what was going to happen and you used it for particular ends and so on and so forth. This one is like, oh, we have to do something, we have to intervene historically into kind of like capital H history. And that's a difficult project. And it's difficult because it does seem to demand that, the way you described is burning it down. And that seems to then repeat the thing you don't want. So yes, and then you have to then tarry with things that make one nervous. And I think for people that engage in metacritique, it especially makes one nervous. So yes, there is only ideology. You can't play outside of it. So then you have to play with it to get what you want. And there's not a lot of playing with it in the way that we might want to. So I don't know if I think you captured it in the way you described where I'm at. I have anxiety about it. I'm equally anxious about not taking this on as a project. Not me personally. I just mean having a project that is quite determinate and ready to say, here's what this looks like. Like, what would be a trek of people in Canada, well, I can't even think of it happening, that would make the same kind of demands. I mean, first of all, it wouldn't happen because it would have to be EVs, and Canada's really far, so you can't possibly go with the charges. They have to stop all the time and charge. You can imagine this kind of thing. But all joking aside, it doesn't happen. Why wouldn't that be an equally powerful response? Well, some of it is, going back to Kara's point, some of it is that you already have an amazing thing that you can activate easily, even in Canada, nationalism. So nationalism doesn't work that well, like in Canada as opposed to the US. Maybe that's why you have to suture oil to it. Because that's the thing where you're like going against somebody's base reality. We need this. This is who we are. And it doesn't speak to everybody, but it's there enough that you can just keep doing it over and over again. And it bites into a lot of people, and a lot of people believe it. For those people.
For everyone. Like, the way the world was before oil was erased by virtue of it. And it happened slowly in North America, but it didn't happen slowly necessarily.
Yes. Right.
And that somehow is forgotten in this story. That oil unmade a world.
Yeah.
And that somehow that world that came afterwards has always been.
Yeah. It like eviscerates history. Yeah.
Completely. And so then I feel like this hinge moment right now, like part of the political problem is not wanting to unmake the world like that. And
Yes.
that's also
Yeah.
a political problem on the right, you know? Like, that way of unmaking a world is too violent.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And so the left is like, how do we unmake it without that violence? And the right is like, how do we not unmake it?
Yeah, and you have on the left variations of this. So one of them was the comment made here about why are you spending your time at COP, like doing these small kind of incremental changes, you're not unmaking the world, you're reinforcing the processes of the other one. And another would be what? How do you do it in a way that could only be, I don't know, blowing up a pipeline? I mean, that doesn't do it either. But yes, I think you've articulated it really well, better than I have.
Okay, thank you, Imre, for wonderful talk and panel. Thanks, everyone. I feel like, yeah, I would love to continue to comment, but I have to castrate not only myself, but the entire audience in the room. I feel like we came to the moment where we should start a conference, begin a conference, yeah, right? We touched up on not only practical, but also ontological horizon of our topic and the dialectics of the infrastructure and the superstructure. But at this point, we have to temporarily close our formal conversation and first of all, thank the library that gave us this fantastic space, and then thank the organizers of this conference, Institute for Global Reconstitution and Barth College Berlin, and also mainly to thank our wonderful team, which is Mitya, Dmitry, and Dmitry, Alexander, who is there, and Natalia, who is not present. Thank you for the technical assistance. Thank you for providing all the wonderful infrastructural and also the narratives. Thank you for our speakers who made all the way from places like Canada, which is really far from here, and places that are also in Germany, but still far, and also in Berlin, but still quite far. So we thank you for this energy, for this warmth and light provided by beautiful minds, but by beautiful, wonderful intellectuals and dear guests, and of course, thank you the audience, the people who were staying with us until the very not the very end, but the very beginning of a new, probably, hopefully, the beginning of a new round of reflection. Yeah, thank you very much. Bye bye.
There's one other person to thank, and on behalf of everybody here, we want to thank you, Oksana, for your role in organizing this, for your energy, for your incredible intellect, for the inputs that you put out there, and for making this happen and for making getting things moving. Thank you.
Yeah, I was not alone. There was Ilya, but unfortunately he had to leave. But we also thank Ilya for the collaboration, co-organization. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.